everyone, and welcome to the Disarmament Orientation course. My name is Hee-Jun Jung. I am a Political Affairs Officer at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, and I'm also part of the unit that supports the implementation of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW. The full name of the convention is the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons, which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effects. The convention is often referred to by its shorter name, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, or by its acronym, the CCW. The convention was adopted in 1980. As the name of the convention suggests, the CCW prohibits or restricts the use of specific types of conventional weapons that are considered to cause unnecessary or unjustifiable suffering to combatants, or to affect civilians in a manner that does not distinguish them from combatants or military objectives. There are 5 protocols annexed to the convention, each of which covers a specific type of weapons. The CCW has 125 high contracting parties and 4 signatories, which are Egypt, Nigeria, Sudan, and Vietnam. It is important to note that when a state joins the convention, it is required to join minimum 2 protocols and not all the protocols, so the membership of each protocol is different, and the membership of each protocol is smaller than the number of parties to the convention as a whole. Some high contracting parties have chosen to be party to all 5 protocols, but this is not the case for all states. The first protocol of the CCW prohibits the use of weapons that injure by fragments that cannot be detected by X-rays. Amendment Protocol 2 of the CCW covers mines, booby traps, and other devices, which include improvised explosive devices, the IEDs. Amendment Protocol 2 sets out detailed prohibitions and restrictions. First of all, it prohibits the use or transfer of mines, booby traps, or other devices that cause unnecessary suffering or indiscriminate harm, and those that hamper deactivation or detection. Amendment Protocol 2 also sets out measures that must be taken in conjunction with the use of certain types of mines in order for the use to be lawful, such as remotely delivered mines and anti-personnel mines. Lastly, this protocol requires parties to protect civilians and cooperate internationally to exchange material and information on mine action. Protocol 3 prohibits attacks by incendiary weapons against the civilian population or civilian object, or in a manner that does not clearly separate the military objective from what is civilian in nature. Also, Protocol 4 of the CCW prohibits blinding laser weapons. Lastly, Protocol 5 requires parties to take action to protect civilians from unexploded and abandoned explosive ordnance, which are the explosive remnants of war. The CCW has evolved since its adoption in 1980. It originally had only 3 protocols, namely Protocol 1, 2, and 3. In 1996, Protocol 4 on blinding laser weapons was added, and Protocol 2 was amended to make it more robust. In 2001, Article 1 of the Convention was amended to cover armed conflicts that are not of an international character, so that all parties to conflict are bound by the CCW. Finally, in 2003, the 5th and last protocol on explosive remnants of war was added. In a normal year, the CCW has several meetings. The group of governmental experts in emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems, the GG on laws, will be covered in depth in a later section of this course. In addition, there are usually expert meetings and annual conferences of Amended Protocol 2 and Protocol 5, as well as the meeting of high contracting parties. There are 3 sets of national annual reports for the CCW. All high contracting parties to the CCW are required to submit a report on overall compliance with the convention, and Amended Protocol 2 and Protocol 5 reporting is required for those who are bound by these protocols. For example, if a state is a party to Amended Protocol 2 but not Protocol 5, it should submit the compliance report and the Amended Protocol 2 report. The compliance reporting covers measures taken to raise awareness of and implement the convention. Amended Protocol 2 and Protocol 5 reporting requests more specific information, such as on clearance and victim assistance. The CCW National Annual Reports are available on the databases on the website of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs.
First, if I may, I'll just give a bit of an overview of the ISU, the Implementation Support Unit. Just to say that we were created by the states parties to provide support to states parties and the office holders of the convention with support and implementation of the convention, as well as to communicate about the convention and be the authority on information concerning the convention. So the convention has a really well-recorded history. It's been documented quite often as a very interesting process, a very dynamic process. It's often referred to as the People's Convention, and I think that has to do with the fact that it started on the ground. The effort to get this convention to prohibit anti-personnel mines started from contaminated countries, from organizations that were there, such as the ICRC medical staff, Physicians for Human Rights, and others, who kept on seeing and treating people with traumatic injuries caused by anti-personnel mines, even after conflicts has ceased. And they were asking themselves this question: why are we seeing all these landmine victims if we're in peace right now? And this brings me to the main issues with these little anti-personnel mines. In the 1990s, these were in the arsenal of most militaries, ready to be used. They're indiscriminate weapons, which means when they're planted, they can't discriminate between a soldier or a civilian. They last a long time. Once planted, they could last 50 to 60 years. We're right now still trying to get rid of anti-personnel mines that were laid during the Second World War, for example. They have a real impact on the community. They cut off agricultural land. They impede development. They impede humanitarian efforts. And they also have a very big impact on allowing communities to reconstruct after conflict. So it's very important to see that the anti-personnel mine is not only the traumatic injury caused to the person, but it has an effect on the entire community. It was also previously assumed to have a great military utility, and that was a theory that was never seriously examined until the mid-90s. So through all this negative effect of anti-personnel mines, a coalition of organizations called the International Campaign to Ban Landmines came together to push for a ban on anti-personnel mines. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting parts of the origin of this convention, is the relationship between civil society and states to reach a ban on anti-personnel mines. Now, a first attempt to do so was done through the United Nations and the treaties in the UN, but it wasn't possible. Due to consensus, states were just not ready to ban anti-personnel mines. So it took an unconventional way, it took outside the United Nations to negotiate a treaty. it was a very interesting negotiation process. The states met in Ottawa, in Canada, for a conference in 1996, and the minister at the time, Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy, challenged the states that were present to come back in 1 year's time to sign a convention banning anti-personnel mines. So this was a big gamble, as they've said in the past. So throughout this year, October 1996, to finally arriving at September 18th, 1997, when the text of the treaty was adopted in Oslo, it took a number of meetings and negotiations in different parts of the world. Again, the relationship between civil society and states was a critical one during this process. And finally, it arrived in Oslo. As I mentioned, 18 September, it was adopted, the treaty text, and it opened for signature in Ottawa in December of 1997. And then entered into force in March 1999. So it was a very unconventional, fast-track negotiation to arrive at a ban. So the whole point of the treaty and the negotiation of the text was to arrive at a comprehensive framework to ensure to end the suffering and casualties caused by anti-personnel mines. That's in the preamble of the convention. It was the aim of the states parties. And so when they negotiated the text, they said, well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to end the suffering and casualties caused by anti-personnel mines? Within the text, there are 4 core commitments that states have to implement and uphold. First, it's universalizing the prohibitions. States parties, today we have 164 states. Well, they have to undertake to never, under any circumstance, use, develop, produce, acquire, stockpile, retain, or transfer to anyone directly or indirectly anti-personnel mines. And they have to not assist, encourage, or induce in any way anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under the convention. Now, this is the first core aim to reach the end of to put an end to the suffering casualties caused by anti-personnel mines. The second core obligation is destroying stockpiles. Today, this has been very successful. Almost 53 million anti-personnel mines have been destroyed from stocks. Today, there's only 3 states that still have stockpiled anti-personnel mines, which has been a great achievement for the convention. And each state party must destroy their stockpiles 4 years after the entry into force of the convention for that state. The third core objective is that of mine clearance. States that join the convention must identify all mined areas under their jurisdiction or control. They must then ensure the exclusion of civilians from these areas, and then they must destroy anti-personnel mines that are within these areas. This is a core commitment to prevent people from falling victim to these mines. And today there are 33 states that are still carrying out obligations under Article 5 of the Convention. A number of states have also implemented the treaty. Today, unfortunately, we're seeing some countries that declared completion now coming back to the table due mostly to the use of improvised anti-personnel mines by non-state armed actors, which is one of the challenges facing the world today. The fourth commitment is that of victim assistance. This is a very important commitment, and partially it's why the convention is often termed as being the first humanitarian disarmament convention. It was the first convention that had provisions for victims of the weapon they were trying to ban within the text, and it was not an easy thing to put in the text. There was a lot of negotiation to put victim assistance within the text, and it finally made it in. And today we see that disarmament treaties such as the Cluster Munition Convention and other conventions, it's it's natural to have a victim assistance text in the convention. But it wasn't at the time. It took a lot of lobbying from a lot of survivors and organizations of persons with disability. So today we have victim assistance, and states are obliged to provide support to victims and to survivors of anti-personnel mines. So those are the 4 core obligations that states parties have to reach their desired outcome of ending the suffering and casualties caused by anti-personnel mines. So the drafters of the convention were pretty wise people. They knew that having prohibitions and having obligations within the treaty wasn't a guarantee that this would happen. So they put a number of additional measures within the convention to ensure implementation of the convention. Now, the first one I'd like to point out is cooperation assistance. This is Article 6 of the convention, and it was a very important part of implementation. In fact, some states said that they couldn't join the convention because they could not fulfill the obligations without international cooperation assistance. So it was a very important part, and under Article 6 of the convention, states that can provide assistance should provide assistance to the implementation of all aspects of the treaty. The second one's compliance. This is a very important part of the treaty. It's critical. And this we find in Article 9 of the Convention, which is national implementation measures. The importance of states having national implementation measures to prevent and suppress any activities prohibited to a state party under the Convention. So a number of states have indicated that they have passed national legislation to implement the convention, or that current legislation is sufficient to cover the implementation of the convention. Another one is transparency. This is a critical aspect as well. This is a self-reporting convention, if you will, and states on an annual basis need to submit an Article 7 transparency report highlighting progress in implementing the different aspects of the convention. And so this is something that the convention or the office holders are constantly working on. I think other conventions face a lot of issues with reporting as well. So we're improving every day on reporting. Finally, implementation support. And this is a very important part. It's not the implementation support unit. We're part of implementation support, but we have the president. The president has a mandate. This year, in 2020, we have Sudan as the president of the convention. We have a number of committees. We have a committee on victim assistance. We have a committee on mine clearance. We have a committee on the enhancement of cooperation and assistance, and we have a committee on cooperative compliance, all with their specific mandates to implement the convention, or so to support states in implementing the convention. We also have a series of meetings. Intersessional meetings are informal meetings of the convention, typically held in May or June. And then we have the formal meetings of the convention or review conferences, typically held at the end of the year. Now, this is not 2 separate meetings, but the intersessional meetings lays the groundwork for the formal meeting of states parties. So any matter related to the convention's implementation is taken on in an informal manner with states implementing the convention, in order for us to be able to come to the meeting of states parties with any matters that are pending, worked out, or advanced towards the meeting. We also have a sponsorship program for these meetings, which allows countries that would not usually be able to come to Geneva, or to come to the meetings wherever they may be, to sponsor their travel and accommodation during the meeting time. We also have the convention action plans. Last year was the 4th review conference in Oslo, and the states parties adopted the Oslo action plan. This is the first time that an action plan has indicators, so it's a very special action plan that we adopted last year. That's innovative. And this is really a tool for the states parties to use to put a little bit more or accelerate the implementation of the convention. And finally, we also have us, the ISU, who is here to support the committees, the president, and the states parties in anything they may need to implement the convention. So this, in short, makes the body of the implementation support to states parties, and to see that the convention's the desire or the aspirations of the states parties are achieved, and that we don't forget where this convention was born, what it set out to do, and we continue to track progress towards this aim. The ISU, please feel free to contact us. We're a small team. We're a total of 3.6 full-time equivalent people. We have expert on victim assistance, on mine clearance, and we're very happy to support any questions that states parties or states not parties may have on the convention. So please do reach out to us at any time should you have any questions on the convention. And our email is isu@apminebandconvention.org. One of the challenges we have and we've had in the past is universalization of the convention. We have 164 states parties at the moment, which is a significant number of states. But we do have and we do want to push for the 33 outstanding states to join as soon as possible. These are big states, some are small states, but each has specific matters that prevent them from joining the convention, or matters they say prevent them from joining the convention. So we work with His Royal Highness Prince Murad of Jordan and Her Royal Highness Princess Astrid of Belgium, who are special envoys, and it's also a mandate of the President to support universalization, to reach out to these states, often to discuss the issues which prevent them from joining the convention. And I should mention that universalization is not a going from state not party to state party. There are things that can be done by states on the road up to becoming a state party. They could put moratorium on use, moratorium on production. They could submit transparency reports voluntarily. So there's a number of things which can be done and steps taken towards universalization or joining the convention. The use of improvised anti-personnel mines has been will be a very big challenge. I think a challenge we'll continue to see as stockpiles get destroyed and as no mines exist in form. They will be perhaps improvised by different groups. And we're seeing that in I think every area of the world. We see it in Colombia, we see it in Africa, we see it in Iraq, we see it in Afghanistan, and other places where groups are improvising anti-personnel mines. And that's why it's increasingly important for states and for organizations to continue re-emphasizing and strengthening the norm of the convention, and not stepping back and allowing these matters to go unaddressed. And the state and the president and other states have condemned the use of mines by any actor throughout the world, and this is something that they do through press releases and through conversations at the meetings of states parties as well, to condemn the use of mines. So that's, I think, one of the biggest obstacles. Another obstacle, I think, that or challenge will be to keep up the level of funding for implementation of the convention. There are a number of states parties which are very close to finishing implementation of their, for example, Article 5 commitment, on the mine clearance commitment. And so one challenge they have is to get the resources they need to get them over the line, to get them to complete implementation of that treaty obligation. Another, I think, challenger that we face is continually improving our support to survivors of anti-personnel mines, and this has to be intrinsically linked to other conventions, such as the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability, and other conventions that protect persons with disability in in natural disasters and things like this. So we will face a challenge in continuing to do so. We must remember that once the mine clearance obligations of the treaty are fulfilled, the commitment to support survivors is not it's not a short-term commitment. This is a lifelong commitment. So we must work with other frameworks to ensure that we fulfill our promise to survivors of anti-personnel mines. So I think those are the biggest challenges that this convention faces going forward.
Why are explosive weapons in populated areas a disarmament issue? Armed conflict has devastating effects on individuals and communities, causing suffering and long-lasting impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. Today, armed conflicts are increasingly taking place in urban environments, which raises important concerns, especially as 2/3 of the global population is predicted to be living in cities by 2030. When explosive weapons are used in populated areas, an average of 90% of reported casualties and injuries are civilians. When considering longer-term effects, the number of victims is surely higher than initial estimates. There are also those who survive, but for whom life is dramatically affected, with many maimed, displaced, traumatized, or suffering the irreparable loss of a loved one. To address the humanitarian harm arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, UN member states, UN agencies, and civil society are involved in consultations towards a political declaration on the issue, led by Ireland since 2019. But before going into the multilateral process, I think it's important to start by describing some of the key terms and unpacking the challenge. The term explosive weapons in populated areas, also known by the acronym EWIPA, is generally used as shorthand to refer to the notion of explosive weapons with a wide impact area, or wide area effects. So what is an explosive weapon? The term explosive weapon refers to munitions that are generally activated by the detonation of a high explosive substance that creates thermal energy and a blast and fragmentation zone. This blast zone has a potential to directly kill or injure any person and damage, degrade, or destroy objects within its radius. The term explosive weapon is used to refer to bombs, artillery shells, missiles, and rocket warheads, mortar rounds, multi-barrel rocket launchers, and improvised explosive devices, among others. Explosive weapons can be considered to have wide area effects, meaning that they're likely to impact an area significantly larger than the intended target when they have one or a combination of the following criteria. One, a large destructive radius from the blast that the explosive yield produces. This is usually due to a large payload, 2, an inaccurate delivery system, such as indirect fire weapons, including artillery and mortars. And 3, the delivery of multiple munitions simultaneously over a wide area. What constitutes a populated area? These are areas with a concentration of civilians or of civilians and civilian objects. It may be permanent, such as cities, towns, and villages, or temporary, like sites for refugees and internally displaced people. And civilian objects are understood to be all objects that are not military targets, such as housing, hospitals, food markets, places of worship, schools, energy and water and sanitation system, among many others. The term civilians is used to refer to people who are not taking part in the conflict. Now let's talk about the direct and reverberating effects of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, with the latter also known as indirect or third-order effects. Direct effects are those caused directly by an explosion as a result of the high-pressure blast wave from the detonation and from the fragmentation of the munition. Direct effects cause civilian death and injury and damage and destruction to civilian objects, and include the primary effects, such as blast overpressure, fragmentation, and heat, and the secondary effects, which can occur from the interaction of the blast, fragmentation, and heat with the surrounding environment. Some examples of secondary effects include secondary fragmentation, firebrands, ground shock and cratering, and flying and falling debris. Reverberating effects, also known as indirect, tertiary, or third-order effects, are those that result as a consequence of the direct impacts from the explosion. These reverberating effects cause civilian harm beyond the time of the explosion and the immediate blast zone. And please, let me be clear on this point. The impacts from using explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas cause severe, broad, cumulative, and enduring indirect harm to civilians. These impacts ripple across space and time through interdependent structural networks. In other words, the effects from the use of EWIPA do not end with the initial blast.
So, what are the existing and new frameworks to address this problem? Now we will explore what is being done to address these challenges mentioned, as well as the existing and new frameworks to prevent and mitigate civilian harm caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. The Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law clearly set out obligations for armed forces to protect the civilian population and civilian objects during armed conflict. The International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, in particular, has documented the challenges of contemporary armed conflict and compliance with IHL in respect to explosive weapons use. Important steps have already been taken over the past decade to improve the understanding of the humanitarian impact of EWIPA. The United Nations, ICRC, and NGOs have published numerous studies to highlight the short and long-term humanitarian impact of the use of explosive weapons with wide area impacts in populated areas. So what are these agencies doing? A recent ICRC report released in 2022 entitled Explosive Weapons with Wide Area Effects in Populated Areas, A Deadly Choice, provides a broad evidence-based assessment of the devastating consequences of the use of these weapons in populated areas. Collecting and sharing data on the impact of EWIPA also facilitates the design of appropriate military doctrine, practice, tactics, and strategy, as well as standards to prevent civilian harm in urban warfare. Disaggregated data on how these impacts spread and evolve will help to inform the understanding of parties to conflict about the reasonably foreseeable reverberating effects from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research have also been working on this topic. UNIDIR has produced a fact sheet to highlight the gendered impacts of the use of EWIPA, recommending disaggregated data collection on the differentiated risks and vulnerabilities faced by women, men, boys, and girls. These recommendations will enable more sustainable relief and recovery efforts, ultimately aiming to enhance the security and well-being of states and people. To help reinforce data collection capacity, UNIDIR has designed 2 menus of indicators to measure the reverberating effects on civilians from the use of EWIPA. The first menu enables the systematic documentation of civilian casualties and injuries, as well as disruptions to the infrastructure of sustainable cities and communities, good health, and education. The second menu examines the consequences from disruptions to water, sanitation, and hygiene services, food security, environmental standards, and economic opportunity. Taken together, these menus of indicators can be used to capture, measure, compare, and understand how the use of EWIPA impacts the survival and human rights of civilians in ways that are often overlooked. At the national level, countries have also taken action on this area. For instance, good practices and compilations of military policy and practice relating to the use of EWIPA have been developed in recent years. The work of the ICRC, the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, among others, demonstrate considerable efforts to include a change in policies and practice of armed forces to strengthen protection for civilians against the use of EWIPA. UNIDIR has also produced research exploring opportunities to improve military policies and practice to reduce civilian harm during urban operations, as well as a fact sheet discussing the gendered impacts of EWIPA. As a diplomat in Geneva, you will probably hear about the process for a political declaration for EWIPA. Over 65 states participate in an ongoing diplomatic process to elaborate a political declaration on explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. This process was encouraged by a 2019 joint appeal issued by the UN Secretary General and the ICRC President on the use of explosive weapons in cities, which called for a commitment to avoid their use in populated areas. In 2019, Ireland initiated the development of a political declaration to address the humanitarian harm arising from the use of EWIPA. The informal consultation on protecting civilians in urban warfare was held in Geneva in November 2019, and this consultation initiated an inclusive and transparent process towards a political declaration to promote actions designed to enhance the protection of civilians in populated areas during conflict and to reduce humanitarian harm from explosive weapons with wide area effects. Most recently, national delegations, UN entities, and civil society met in Geneva from 6 to 8 April 2022 to conduct negotiations towards the political declaration. Speaking directly on this issue, the UN Secretary General called for a strong text that includes an express commitment to avoid the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. The final round of consultations is expected to take place in June of 2022, and this aims to conclude the text of the agreement before it will be open for adoption by United Nations member states. Against the backdrop of destruction in many cities across the world, these consultations offer an opportunity to adopt measures that will go a long way towards preventing and mitigating the impact of urban warfare on civilians.
Process. So why is ammunition important? At the outset, let me begin by pointing out the highly sensitive nature of ammunition. Ammunition is we call it the direct fuel for conflict and organized crime, terrorism, even more than small arms and light weapons. And if the premise here is if you get control over ammunition, you can reduce the impact and the effects of conflict and armed violence around the world, even if many weapons are still available for years. So here, ineffective conventional ammunition management is a growing concern for the international community. And on one hand, the issue is ammunition diversion to unauthorized users, as I said, including criminal and terrorist groups. And on the other hand, unplanned explosions at munition sites, which affect civilian population and infrastructure and the environment as well. And despite the severity of this dual risk, conventional ammunition has long lacked a comprehensive, dedicated process at the multilateral level. And this is because the issue of regulating conventional ammunition has been controversial in the UN for decades, since there was no consensus to integrate ammunition in the UN Program of Action on small arms and light weapons. This has been a key gap in conventional arms control at the UN level since the creation of the UN Program of Action back in 2001. So what has happened in the last decades? Basically, in 2018, there was a first group of governmental experts on the issue of conventional ammunition. The group's recommendations in 2018 focused on or led to the development of the International Ammunition Technical Guidelines, the IATGs. The IATGs are a very long and technical document, very authoritative document that provide technical guidance at UN level for ammunition safety and to a certain extent security within stockpile. But is this enough to address the issue of ammunition? And what we've seen is that it is not enough. What is missing is an overall policy framework and technical guidance for ammunition security throughout the supply chain. So addressing the security, the diversion dimension of the issue. And both the policy framework and the guidance on supply chain or security are needed for sustained political buy-in. And this is something that I think, in a sense, the GGE and the creation of the IATGs after the GGE in 2008, it was the way that member states took to basically taking the second step before the first by creating first the technical guidance without having the dedicated framework to address the problem of ammunition control. So in light of this, in 2017, there was a call for a second UN group of governmental experts to address the issue of conventional ammunition management in a more comprehensive manner. And the GGE was agreed by, this new GGE was agreed by the UN General Assembly by consensus with the adoption of Resolution 7255 on problems arising from the accumulation of conventional ammunition stockpiles and surplus. The resolution mandated the UN Secretary General to convene the GGE in 2020. So what happened after? So to prepare the GGE, there were 6 informal consultations in New York, and the chair designate at this point, or the leading entity at this point was the government of Germany, who conducted regional outreach in different regions in the world. So there were also regional meetings in Addis Ababa, in Abidjan, in Lima, in Kingston, in Vienna as well, to understand the regional dynamics. And on top of that, UNIDIR also held 3 seminars in Geneva and in New York, with a total of more than 200 experts to develop substantive ideas for the GGE, but in a participatory manner with technical experts and open to all UN member states. And with all these consultations, seminars, and technical dialogues, it became clear that the GGE needed to address not only surplus of ammunition, but the whole life cycle of ammunition management. And that the greatest challenges remaining to solve were both safety and security considerations, and in particularly security considerations and the illicit proliferation and misuse of ammunition in terrorism, armed conflict, and armed violence. So the first session of this GE took place in January 2020 in New York, and at that time, the group was composed of a total of 18 members, and the group achieved gender parity and geographic diversity. And right after that, the pandemic hit, and the GG had to adjust a little bit. So there was an informal session in April 2020, and then the work of the group concluded with 2 sessions later on in May in Geneva, in May 2021 and September 2021 in New York. So what is what the GGE recommended? The key recommendation that appears in the GGE report is to establish a new global comprehensive framework on conventional ammunition at the UN level. And within this framework, the GGE is recommending that member states negotiate a set of political commitments under the auspices of the UN General Assembly. And these political commitments should address both safety, the risk of explosions, and security, the risk of diversion, proliferation, and misuse, from the point of production until disposal or use. So we are talking here about the through life management of ammunition. And this set of political commitments should, on the one hand, identify and promote safety and security measures, and on the other hand, identify and promote measures that are designated to monitor and enhance the effectiveness of through life management at all stages of ammunition management, including, let's say, surveillance, incident investigation, record keeping, investigation and analysis of diverted ammunition, or international cooperation in investigations to address diversion. So a major point of the GGE discussion was also the divergent views of states with regards to the possible legally binding provisions as part of this new instrument. Some members saw this as something that was necessary to achieve meaningful process on the ground, and others were in clear opposition against these legally binding elements. And what the GG recommended in the end was to deal with this basically proposing a set of political commitments at the global level and leaving the decision of turning these political commitments into legally binding mechanisms or instruments at the regional or sub-regional level. That was the recommendation. But the GGE also recommended that the political commitments could be or would be complemented by an implementation mechanism at the global level with a few elements. And which were those elements? First, well, the facilitation of international cooperation and assistance to support states in their implementation efforts, and to ensure that there are needs-based and tailored operationalization of standards, guidelines, and best practices. Secondly, the development of voluntary operational guidelines related to security aspects to complement the existing IATGs, the International Ammunition Technical Guidelines. Third, it recommended supporting voluntary adoption of national, regional, and sub-regional levels or targets or indicators to identify opportunities to support information exchange among states. Fourth, they recommended the development of an online repository of regional, sub-regional, and national political commitments. And finally, the facilitation of member states' participation in regular meetings to follow up and exchange information on implementation efforts. So these were the recommendations of the GT. But what is next? What is going to happen after the conclusion of the GGE? Well, the report was welcomed in the fall last year by the UN General Assembly in its resolution 76/233, And this resolution encouraged states to consider the GG recommendations and decided to establish an open-ended working group to elaborate the set of political commitments as a new global framework to address existing gaps in through-life ammunition management at every level, at the national, regional, sub-regional, and global levels. So this open-ended working group already had a two-day organizational session in February 2022, and it will have two 5-day sessions in 2022. The first one in May in New York and the second one in August in Geneva, to finalize with a third 5-day session in 2023 in February in New York. All these substantive sessions will be preceded by informal consultations with contribution from relevant international and non-governmental organizations. And the goal for this open-ended working group is to submit a report. And within this report include the recommendations on the set of political commitments as a new global framework to be decided by the 78th session of the General Assembly. So why is this important for the diplomatic community in Geneva? Well, apart from part of the sessions being hosted in Geneva, the Geneva community will also play an important role in the implementation of this framework. There are institutions that have a good depth of knowledge on conventional ammunition management based in Geneva, and that will certainly play an important role in this not only process, but also in the implementation mechanism that could come out of this process. And here we can mention not only UNIDIR, but also the GACHE, Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining, and their ammunition management advisory team, but also the Small Arms Survey and others. So in conclusion, the last years have produced a lot of knowledge that you can access through several publications, including UNIDIR publications. But the most important work was the one that was conducted by the GG and now being conducted by the open-ended working group. And for that, the GG report provides a substantive roadmap with relevant information and technical recommendations, actually, for the open-ended working group to basically seize the opportunity and fill a gap in conventional arms control. And I think this is probably what we are going to be seeing in the next couple of years. So if we consider ammunition as the orphan of conventional arms control, I think now member states have the opportunity and the responsibility to find a home for this orphan of conventional arms control. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and see you soon.
Welcome to Geneva, where you will hear so much talk about and so many organizations involved in small arms and light weapons control, often represented with the acronym SALW. You may be wondering, what are small arms and light weapons, and why has this issue received so much attention and traction in the conventional arms domain? Interestingly, despite all the efforts and organizations and institutions involved in small arms and light weapons control, very few treaties define these explicitly. A 1993 group of governmental experts on small arms defined small arms as weapons designed for personal use, and light weapons as weapons designed to be used by several persons serving as a crew. In terms of examples, small arms include revolvers, self-loading pistols, carbines, and rifles, while light weapons include heavy machine guns and portable launchers of anti-tank systems. So why is small arms and light weapons control so important? This is the case because their illicit production, transfer, and misuse can result in devastating effects on civilians, communities, and states. The illicit production, transfer, and misuse of small arms and light weapons can impede the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2001, in 2005, former Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Kofi Annan, quoted that in terms of death toll, the death toll caused from small arms dwarfs that of other weapons systems. And in terms of carnage, small arms could be considered as the real weapons of mass destruction. In 2018, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his disarmament agenda, stated that on the average, in every 15 minutes, there is a violent death caused from a firearm. This is why small arms and light weapons control is very important. Due to this, there are several treaties, instruments, and regimes in small arms and light weapons control. These include the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms, the Arms Trade Treaty, the International Tracing Instrument, and the Firearms Protocol, just to mention a few. In this presentation, I'll present a brief overview on the Arms Trade Treaty and the UN Programme of Action. The UN Programme of Action on Small Arms, popularly called the UNPOA, was adopted by UN member states in 2001. The UNPOA is a politically binding instrument. This means that states have agreed to a set of political commitments, and in case they are not able to implement these fully, there are no sanction regimes or mechanisms against them. In the UNPOA, states committed to 4 main agreements. First of all, to improve national legislations on small arms and light weapons control. Secondly, to improve import and export control mechanisms on the national level for small arms and light weapons. Thirdly, to improve stockpile management practices for small arms and light weapons. And finally, to engage in international cooperation and assistance on small arms and light weapons control issues. The UNPOA Secretariat is the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs office in New York. And so the UNODA is in charge of organizing the biennial meeting of states on the UNPOA, which is an annual meeting where states discuss and report on progress in implementing the POA. In the POA, states also committed to report every 2 years on the status of its implementation on the national level. Finally, I would like to talk about the Arms Trade Treaty, popularly known as the ATT. The ATT is the most recent international instrument adopted in the conventional arms domain. The ATT is a legally binding instrument as opposed to the POA, which is a politically binding one. The ATT was adopted in 2013 and entered into force in December 2014. The objective of the treaty is to promote the highest possible international standards for the regulation of international transfer of conventional arms and to prevent, eradicate, and mitigate against the illicit transfer and diversion of conventional arms. I should note that the ATT has a broader scope beyond small arms and light weapons. This means that apart from small arms and light weapons control, the ATT also regulates the transfer of other conventional arms systems, including battle tanks, attack helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, among others. The ATT currently has 111 state parties, with Philippines being the most recent state that joined in March 2022.
Well, there are different kinds of obligations that the treaty brings forward. As an example, I'll just touch on a few. There are many, but I'll touch just on a few. One of them, which is very critical, is about Article 5 of the treaty, which is generally about general implementation, the kind of infrastructure that a state needs to have. As an example, Article 5 requires states parties to establish and maintain a national control system. That national control system is what enables the state to actually implement, therefore, all the other provisions of the ATT. So if you have a very sound national control system, that would include a national control list, a national control authority, as well as a national point of contact. So if those are well established, well maintained, and well implemented, generally you find that states are able to undertake their responsibilities under the ATT. But the second one, which is also very important, is about Article 6 and 7 of the ATT, which basically lays out what we would call the core of the treaty. Article 6 actually sets out the grounds on which arms transfers can be prohibited. For instance, states parties are prohibited from authorizing a transfer to a receiving state if such a transfer would undermine, as an example, measures adopted under the UN Security Council, as an example, one. But two, if a transfer would violate commitments that a state has or obligations that a state has under other instruments, they are prohibited from actually authorizing such a transfer. So Article 6 is basically very important, because if those prohibitions or if those grounds that are set out in Article 6 are prevalent or are available, so a state party is not authorized to go ahead with a transfer. Article 7, in the event that a transfer is not prohibited, Article 7, therefore, actually calls upon states parties to undertake what we call is risk assessment. They have to assess whether the transfer that they are about to authorize is associated, is there any risk that can be associated with such a transfer. And if there is a risk that they identify, therefore the states party that is exporting must be able to take mitigation actions. And if those mitigation actions cannot totally address the risk, so a state party therefore cannot proceed with an authorization. So 6 and 7 are very essential because they actually set out the standards of responsibility in arms transfer. And of course we've got Article 13 that talks about reporting. If you're a state party, you are expected to provide reports, and there's two kinds of reports that we expect under the treaty. One is called initial report. Initial report is a report that a state party who is new to the treaty will have to submit to ourselves, the Secretariat. But that initial report is supposed to actually set out or inform us about the measures that a state has adopted to implement the ATT. Because if you are a state party, therefore you are required to have certain obligations implemented, but you must therefore tell us what are those measures that we have at the national level adopted to see the implementation of the treaty. But also the other report is called the annual report, where a state party on yearly basis is expected to submit an annual report, which accounts for transfers conducted in a previous year. So the reporting obligations that are embedded in the treaty are very essential because they actually support the transparency objective of the treaty. And finally, there's also a Article 15 and 16, which is about international cooperation as well as international assistance, which is very important in this. Article 15 sets out the rules of cooperation among states so that they can be able to cooperate amongst each other with a view of achieving the effective implementation of the treaty. Because it's only when states cooperate that you can have the objectives of the ATT advanced. And I say so because by definition, the ATT is about transfer of arms beyond one state. So there's quite a number of states that are involved. So the cooperation among states becomes very essential in getting the states to effectively implement the ATT. And finally, we've got Article 16 that talks about arrangements for assistance among states. Where states in a position to provide support to others, they can do so. And those who are requesting assistance, they can get assistance. And in that context, we also have the trust fund that is established as a mechanism of taking forward assistance. In summary, that is the key obligations of the treaty. Thank you. Article 18 of the treaty establishes the Secretariat as a unit that is tasked with the responsibility of supporting states in the implementation of their obligations under the treaty. And of course, the treaty says it will be a minimized secretariat in a minimized structure. So it's not a big secretariat. In total, we have about 4 staff members. And our role largely is to ensure that we support the state parties in implementing their obligations. But some of the activities that we carry out are, as an example, one is we serve as the repository of the database of national points of contacts. Under the treaty, states are supposed to provide us with information on national points of contacts. We have that database, so we're a repository of that. We maintain the reporting system of the ATT. We also facilitate the work of conference by actually supporting the office holders, the president, vice presidents, and all other subsidiary bodies established under the ATT.
The ATT Secretariat is hosted in Geneva, so you therefore find most of the meetings, side events, and presentations on the ATT happening in Geneva. The ATT Secretariat organizes 3 meetings every year for ATT state parties and stakeholders. The first preparatory meeting is often held in February. The second preparatory meeting is often held in April. And the final conference of state parties is often held in the summer in August. Every year, the ATT state parties select a president who also chooses a thematic focus for his presidency. For the year 2022, Germany is the president of the ATT and has selected post-shipment controls as its thematic focus. One particular feature about the ATT is that amongst its 28 articles, it has a provision known as the Voluntary Trust Fund. This is a mechanism in the ATT where state parties can request for and receive various types of support, including legislative support, institutional capacity building for implementing the treaty in their state.
ATT comprises of a mixed bag of states. There are states that are exporting states, importing states, transit states, and all of it. But each state presents a different infrastructure baseline. So generally, the exporting states have in place some control systems. But other states who are generally not in that category are still at the stage of trying to establish the national control systems. So the discussion then in the ATT is about how we share experience between the 2 groups or 3 groups of states, where those who have at least now some control systems in place, they start to share experience on how they establish their control systems and how the others can learn from that. And also ensuring that those who are implementing their obligations, trying to establish control systems, are able to learn from those who have been in the game longer than themselves. That is one issue. But the second one is about reporting. One of the key objectives of the treaty is to create transparency around arms transfers. There are always challenges around reporting, because reporting is not just a question of submitting a report. It's a question of saying, how do you actually get the report organized? Firstly, how do you actually populate the report? Where do you get the information? How do you synthesize it? And how do you therefore ultimately submit it? So some of the discussion is about how states can therefore then be able to establish some systems at a national level that will help them to have these reports actually processed through right up to the point when they are submitted over here. Another point, topical point, is about the national coordination processes, and we all know that arms transfers requires inputs or discussion even within a state, where you have different agencies coming together and providing different perspectives on an application on the table at any given point in time. And that national coordination, agency coordination, and the like, there's a lot of discussion about that, how states can actually do the national coordination with a view of ensuring that the decisions that they arrive at the end of the process is a much more balanced decision, but is also in line with the provisions of the treaty. So those are but some of the issues that are currently being discussed within the ATT at present.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about the Convention on Cluster Munitions today. My name is Sheila Mwemba. I'm the director of the Implementation Support Unit of the Convention on Cluster Munitions that is based in Geneva. Today, I'm going to just give a very brief overview of what the convention hopes to achieve, how it came into being, where it is in terms of implementation at this stage, and what some of the plans going ahead are. So let's get into it. What is a cluster munition? Cluster munitions are weapons that are contained within a large container that opens up in the air and scatters large numbers of cluster explosive submunitions or bomblets over a wide area. Now, depending on the model, these submunitions could number anywhere from 10 to 600, and they can be delivered by aircraft, artillery, or missiles. So why are they so bad? First of all, we can see the effect when they are deployed, how they scatter over a wide area, and just the effects. So the first thing is the wide area effect. They are not precise weapons, meaning that they tend to take out a very large area when deployed. And usually this means that it takes out more than the targeted area. Then there's the high failure rate. You will see these on the bottom here. These are submunitions that have failed to detonate after they have been deployed. Now, the failure rate can go up to 40%, which is extremely high. And they act and they continue to be dangerous. And then there's the lasting effect on civilians. You can see the damage to homes, to limbs, to life, So you can see that even after conflict has ended, the weapons continue to pose a threat and can be a blockage to development, meaning that this is land that cannot be used because it's contaminated, it's dangerous, and it also blocks access to services. It could be access to hospitals, to schools, to even just agricultural land. So how did the convention come into being? We usually refer to the process that led to the adoption of the Convention on Cluster Munitions as the Oslo process. Oslo, because the first meeting that was held to discuss components of the convention was held in Oslo in February 2007. The process itself includes a series of regional and global conferences where countries came together to discuss what would go into the convention. And in May of 2008, the diplomatic conference to negotiate the convention was held, and it opened for signature on the 3rd of December 2008 and entered into force on the 1st of August 2010. So this August will mark 12 years since the convention entered into force. So what are the main objectives of the convention? Well, we can categorize them into 3 groups. So the CCM aims to prevent further use, production, transfer of cluster munitions. It also aims to mitigate, that is to undertake remedial measures in instances where cluster munitions have been used. And also it aims to cooperate in implementation of the convention. And this is really talking about partnerships, existing partnerships, and how they are enhanced and nurtured to ensure that the convention is implemented. So what are these key provisions? I will look at 7 of them today. And the first one is Article 1. And this is usually what we refer to in terms of implementation as universalization of the convention. This is where states parties agree and commit to never use, develop, produce, acquire, stockpile, retain, or transfer cluster munitions, and encourage those that have not yet joined the convention to do so. Then we have Article 3, which is on stockpile destruction. Stockpile destruction obligates all states parties to destroy any stockpile they are holding at entry into force of cluster munitions within 8 years of the convention entering into force for the country. It also provides for a deadline extension should a country be unable to destroy all its stockpiles within those 8 years. Then we have Article 4, which is on clearance and risk education. And this requires that all states parties that have been contaminated with cluster munitions to clear all areas under its jurisdiction or control within 10 years of the convention entering into force for it. Similarly, in this case, if a state is unable to complete clearance within the initial 10 years, they have the option to request an extension of that deadline for up to 5 years at a time. Then we have an element in this convention that is completely new to a disarmament treaty such as this one, which is the victim assistance, the provision to provide for victims of cluster munitions. And what Article 5 of the convention really promotes is a holistic approach, an integrated approach to how victims are taken care of, how they are reintegrated into society, how they are provided for, and most importantly, how they participate in decision making processes with regards to victim assistance. Then we have Article 6. The Convention on Cluster Munitions is very much a cooperative convention, which means that it is founded on states, parties, and other actors, civil society, working together to ensure that the convention is fully implemented. Then we have Article 7, which is an obligation that applies to all states parties, and this is transparency measures. All states parties are required to submit 2 types of reports. The first one is the initial transparency report, which is submitted 180 days after the convention has entered into force for the new state party. And thereafter, they're required to submit annual reports, which are due on the 30th of April of each year. Now, these reports are very important because this provides the convention with a baseline for monitoring and evaluating and implementation of the convention. This is how we know from year to year how the convention is faring, and also on an individual state party level, it helps to see how a country is progressing in its implementation, and also to highlight any challenges that they might have, and thus be able to provide them with the necessary cooperation and assistance to meet these obligations. Then we have Article 9, which also applies to all states parties, whether they're contaminated or not, hold stockpiles or don't. So this article requires that every state party undertakes the necessary national measures to fully implement the convention. This could include the enactment of specific or other legislation to make sure that the convention is fully domesticated within a state party. And ideally, this should include penal sanctions. A number of states have actually, about 12 states parties have gone further and included in their legislation that it is prohibited to invest in cluster munitions. Next slide. So in terms of membership, currently the convention has 110 states parties. You will see on the map there how this membership is distributed across the globe. So we have 34 states parties in Europe, 34 in Africa, 25 in the Americas, 8 in the Pacific, 6 in Asia, and 3 in the Middle East. We still have 13 signatory states. 9 of those are in Africa. You will see that these are the ones that are not shaded darkly, very dark. And then we have the rest in other parts of the world. In terms of stockpile destruction, I talked earlier about initial transparency reports. 41 states parties in the initial transparency reports informed that they had stockpiles of cluster munitions. The good news is that to date, 36 of those states parties have completed destruction of their cluster munition stockpiles. So currently we only have 5 states still to comply with this obligation. 2 of those states were unable to do so within the initial 8 years and have now requested extensions. In terms of clearance of areas contaminated with cluster munition remnants, of the 17 states that reported to have had such contamination, 7 now have completed clearance, and we have 10 still to comply. Because some of the most contaminated countries in the world have joined the convention, they need more than the 10 years provided to do so. And so far we've had at least 5 countries submit requests for extensions of the 10. We talked about enhancing partnerships to implement the convention. During the German presidency of the convention, presiding over the 7th meeting of states parties, they introduced a concept referred to as country coalitions, which is really a tailor-made kind of partnership to ensure that a country that has obligations to meet, particularly those that are time-bound, does so within the provided time frame, or at least as soon as possible soon as possible after the initial deadline has passed. And so far, we've had 4 such country coalitions established. And these are coalitions that really are founded on ownership by the country that has the obligation, in partnership with other actors, such as the operators on the ground, as well as donor states. 2 of these have now met their obligation and have since closed, and we have 2 that are still working. In terms of reporting, which I already spoke of, initial transparency reporting is at 92%, which is really, really good, even though we have a few countries that still have initial reports outstanding. However, when we look at the annual reporting rate, this rate drops quite significantly. And usually this is because states, parties that have no contamination, no stockpiles, no victims, and have never produced, usually have nothing new to report. And as such, they tend not to send in their annual reports. I suppose the good news is that countries that do have obligations tend to report at 99%. So the ones that do have updates to give are reporting. Then in terms of, Article 9, I spoke about how countries under this provision are required to implement the necessary measures to make sure that the CCM is properly implemented. You will see that 63 states parties have reported to either have specific CCM legislation or existing law that is sufficient to implement the convention. Let me now talk about how the convention itself manages, how it implements. We have what we refer to as the annual, the action plans. These tend to cover a 5-year period. The current one is the Lausanne Action Plan, which was adopted at the close of the second review conference in September 2021. This action plan builds on the previous one, the Dubrovnik Action Plan, which had been adopted at the conclusion of the first review conference in Dubrovnik, Croatia. And that had been built on the first action plan of the convention, the Vientiane Action Plan that was agreed to in 2010. So this current action plan, the Lausanne Action Plan, will cover 5 years, from 2021 to 2026, when the third review conference is expected to be held. And it really has 3 main objectives. First of all, the states parties reaffirm their determination to fully universalize the convention and all that its aims, its norms, and strengthen the norms against use. Also to intensify efforts to complete time-bound obligations as soon as possible within the set deadlines, or soon, as soon as possible thereafter if they are unable to meet the original deadline. The action plan also underlines the importance of the spirit of cooperation and to continue and enhance existing partnerships amongst all actors, which are states parties and operators and civil society. So how does the convention work? I've already spoken about the review conferences, which are held every 5 years. Then we have the annual meetings, which are the meetings of states parties, where the 10th meeting of states parties is scheduled for August 30th to 2nd of September 2022 in Geneva. And for the first time since 2015, we're having intersessional meetings, which will be held in May, on the 16th and 17th of May. These were held prior to the second review conference, but they were discontinued for various reasons. But states parties during the second review conference agreed that these would be held going forward as necessary. States would agree whether or not to have these meetings from year to year, and it was agreed that this year there would be an intersessional meeting. Then we have the thematic working groups that make part of the coordination committee, which is chaired by the president of the convention. And the current president is the president of the 10th meeting of states parties, the United Kingdom, who will preside over the meeting in September. So this is how the coordination committee looks like. You have the president, supported by 14 states that that serve as the thematic coordinators for a 2-year period, and they are in turn supported by the implementation support unit. So we have 2 countries working on these thematic areas that help to guide other states parties in their implementation of these key provisions. So what about the implementation support unit? What is its mandate? So primarily its mandate is to support all states parties in the implementation of the convention. It also provides support to the convention's machinery, which is made up of the presidency and the thematic coordinators. It also provides advice and technical support to individual states parties. It's also responsible for keeping records and maintaining the convention's website, which I hope you will find time to go and visit. And also, it also engages in promoting universalization. So we engage with states not yet party to help them navigate through what the convention is about. So the CCM also has quite a number of publications. We have, for instance, a guide to cluster munitions that was a partnership with the GICHD, the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining, which hosts the ISU. There was also a publication on a guide to an integrated approach to victim assistance. And all these publications are available on the CCM website in downloadable PDF downloadable format. The Lausanne Action Plan is currently only available in English, but it will be made available as soon as possible, probably in the next quarter, in Arabic, Spanish, and French. The guide is also available in English, French, and Arabic. We also have other brochures for states that, or anyone who would want to know more about the convention, available on the website. This is how the website looks, and I wish to take this opportunity to invite you to visit the website and to contact us if you have any questions or can't find anything on the website. Thank you very much.